Oh, the peace of Christ be with you from Zoomlandia. I don't think anyone can hear me.
We can hear you fine, Robert, and thank you. Peace to you as well.
Reading is from the Gospel according to Matthew, verses 9 through 15. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came and were sitting with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard this, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." Then the disciples of John came to him, saying, why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, the wedding guests cannot mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them, can they? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. This is the story of our faith. Thanks be to God.
I'm aware that much of the news of the last 24 hours is focused on US military strikes in Iran. It was only a matter of time before the violence of our government against people here at home spilled over into violence abroad. But these things are related. And we planned this service to celebrate Pride, so let's celebrate Pride. It seems like a difficult time to celebrate Pride. The current administration rode into office on a wave of prejudice against the trans community. The current occupant of the Oval Office has signed an executive order declaring that there are only two genders and that they are, quote, unchangeable. He has signed an order restricting gender-affirming health care for people under age 19. He has dictated that trans people have no right to serve in the military. As part of his binge against diversity, equity, and inclusion, his administration has taken actions like scrubbing the word transgender from all government websites. And many of his followers have used this opportunity to settle scores with others in the LGBTQ community as well. The Secretary of Defense celebrated Pride Month by removing the name of openly gay San Francisco supervisor Harvey Milk, a Korean War veteran, from a naval service ship. Just last week, the Southern Baptist Convention lent its support to legal efforts to overturn Obergefell versus Hodges, the marriage equality ruling. And I expect that a challenge to marriage equality will land in front of the Supreme Court. We need to take this seriously. When governments start declaring that people don't exist or erasing people from history, this is a dangerous move. These unconstitutional acts are going to make it harder for trans people to receive essential health care. They are being used as a pretext to withdraw funding from universities, school systems, and healthcare providers. And they contribute to a culture of violence against the LGBTQ community. If the government doesn't treat LGBTQ people as human, then those who have a tendency to commit violence will feel they don't need to treat them as human either. This is particularly frightening for trans people of color who are already victims of violence in staggering numbers. I also can't help but notice that at the same time these moves by the administration are dangerous, they're also a little pathetic. It's as if they really believe that by signing an executive order, they can keep LGBTQ people and allies from existing or taking part in society. that genie is already out of the bottle. They're creating a moral panic around these issues because LGBTQ people and allies have already challenged the definitions of gender, sexuality, family, and relationships. The opponents of change wouldn't be so panicked if these changes hadn't already begun to take root in the culture. In the end, this backlash against LGBTQ people and allies is going to end up in the same place as all the other movements of its kind, in the same place as Anita Bryant and the Save the Children campaign of the 70s, Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority of the 80s, in the same place as all those voter initiatives in California, like the Briggs Initiative, the Knight Initiative, and Proposition 8. That is, these movements will end up on the ash heap of history. The only question is how much needless suffering they will cause in the meantime. But until then, living through this kind of backlash can be really demoralizing. We begin to feel alone, as though the whole country has turned against us. So we have to find sources of strength and resistance. I want to suggest we can find strength in our faith tradition and in moments of history where, against the odds, people have stood up against the forces of prejudice. Let's start by talking about Jesus. When Jesus goes to the feast given by Matthew, he is accepting an invitation from the dregs of society. Tax collectors in ancient Palestine were not sober and objective civil servants. They were people who got rich off the system. They could charge whatever they wanted to make a profit over and above the Roman tax rate. They were assisting the Roman Empire in the oppression of the people. And they were considered unclean according to Jewish law because they dealt with secular money and interacted with Gentiles. The passage also labels the people Jesus was dining with as sinners. In this case, sinners means people who were judged to be in violation of the Mosaic law and therefore could not participate in worship in the synagogue. You can maybe imagine who some of those people are because Jesus interacts with them throughout the Gospels. They may have been sex workers. They may have been people who didn't fit the norms, or they may have had people who had physical ailments or disabilities that made them unclean. They also may have been people who didn't fit the norms of gender and sexuality, including eunuchs, those who dressed differently from their assigned gender, or men who were in same-sex relationships. Another word for sinners in this case might be outcasts. When asked by the Pharisees why he dines with these unclean people, Jesus gives an answer that might seem satisfying to the self-righteous. He says, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick." This could be read as a kind of judgment by diagnosis on the tax collectors and sinners, as though they're the sick ones and they need Jesus as their doctor. But Jesus doesn't actually say that. He doesn't identify who the sick ones are. It could just as easily be a diagnosis of the Pharisees and the scribes. In condemning the people Jesus is dining with, they reveal their own sickness. In fact, he says he comes not to call the righteous, but sinners. In doing this, Jesus upends the expected moral order. If it's the sinners that Jesus has called into community and table fellowship, then the so-called righteous who stand by and criticize, they're the real outcasts. I want to stress that Jesus doesn't oppose the concept of Jewish purity codes, particularly in the book of Matthew, which is the most Jewish of the Gospels. In Matthew chapter 5, he says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets." Jewish purity rituals around eating are quite beautiful. There's the ritual of the Netilat Yadayim, or ritual washing of hands and saying a blessing before breaking the bread. Doing these rituals brings about mindfulness of the spiritual significance of eating and the continuing presence of God in our everyday activities. What Jesus objected to was not the existence of these purity rituals, but the way that religious leaders of his time used them to exclude people from fellowship with the community and with God. Another element this passage highlights is what some commenters have called Jesus' party ethic. A lot of significant events in Jesus' ministry take place at parties and celebrations. What's often called the first miracle of Jesus is turning water into wine at the wedding in Cana, essentially turning a great party into a raging party. In the Matthew passage, Jesus calls himself the bridegroom. Wherever Jesus is, he brings the party. He acknowledges that it's not going to last forever. He says the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them and then they will fast. But as long as he's around, the party's going to continue. He sets a good example for us to celebrate in the moment. He knows he lives in constant danger under an unjust government. But his answer to this, in the immortal words of Bill and Ted, from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, a movie I watched back in the 80s when I was a kid, is party on, dude. In difficult times, we can take strength in this tradition of celebration and fellowship with those on the margins. Unfortunately, the church has not always lived up to the standard set by Jesus. Like any religious institution, we have often created barriers to inclusion and have misused our faith to draw the line between insiders and outsiders. But there have been remarkable moments in history when Christians have stood up for the outcasts, often risking rejection themselves. Most historians date the beginning of the modern gay rights movement to the 1969 Stonewall riots in New York. Prior to that, advocating for the rights of LGBTQ people, it was unheard of. It was a bit like advocating for the rights of space aliens or something. There was no concept that these people deserved to be treated fairly, and many refused to believe they even existed. In the post-war era, the most hostile group to LGBT people was not the religious community, but the mental health community. Most psychologists of the time believed that queer people were sick, neurotic people, sort of like the judgment by diagnosis Jesus hints at. In 1957, the psychiatrist Edmund Bergler published a book called Homosexuality, Disease or Way of Life. And he wrote, "The entire personality structure of the homosexual is pervaded by the unconscious wish to suffer. If the external difficulties confronting the homosexual were removed, the homosexual would still be an emotionally sick person. Homosexuality is not the, quote, way of life these sick people gratuitously assume it to be, but a neurotic distortion of the whole personality. There are no healthy homosexuals." Bergler was not expressing a fringe opinion. This was the mainstream position of the mental health community at the time. This makes it all the more remarkable that in 1964, a group of Bay Area clergy and gay rights activists got together to found the Council on Religion and the Homosexual. It began with a weekend retreat in Marin County that included clergy from Methodist, Lutheran, Episcopalian, and United Church of Christ denominations. And yes, I know there were no Presbyterians in that group, but we'll stake a claim with the mainline Protestants. The other attendees were early gay and lesbian rights campaigners from the Mattachine Society, the Daughters of Bilitis, the League for Civil Education, and the Gay Tavern Guild. There's an online exhibit about the Council on Religion and the Homosexual in the LGBT Religious Archives Network, which I've included a link to in the bulletin. Check it out. It's really fascinating. Looking over the agenda for this first meeting, it strikes me how social the events were. A lot of get-to-know-you time for all of these gay and lesbian activists and upstanding clergy members at this retreat, including picnics, swimming, and hiking together. There's even an outing to gay bars in the city, including, quote, a special program at the Pink Octopus. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall for that one. You can just hear the religious critics of the day saying to these clergy members, "Why are you picnicking and swimming and hiking and going to the pink octopus with these sinners?" Embracing Jesus' party ethic, they decided their first public event would be a New Year's Day benefit dance in San Francisco. As the LGBT Religious Archives Network says, notwithstanding the irony that CRH's first major public event was a lavish drag ball, the clergy worked with the homophile groups to ensure success of this event. This included negotiating terms with the San Francisco police and city government that were notorious for the harassment and persecution of gays and lesbians. Despite the social standing of the clergy involved and their attempts to negotiate with the police, when the night of the ball came, multiple police cars, a paddy wagon, and around 30 police officers showed up. They began shining Klieg lights and taking pictures of those entering the event. This itself was an act of harassment. Remember, being outed as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender at that time could lead to the loss of your job, could lead to the loss of your family, your church, your community. Members of the police sex crimes unit came into the event to inspect what was going on. They were met by lawyers retained by the council, telling them they had no right to enter a private event without a warrant. The lawyers were arrested on charges of interfering with police officers, and several others were arrested too. The police harassment caused many to leave for fear of recovery. The police raid could have been the end of it. The clergy members of the council could have come away from that night convinced they shouldn't associate publicly with queer people. It could be risky to their reputations and their church positions. They could have promised to keep future interactions with the community quiet and taken a less public profile. Instead, the day after the dance, 7 ministers showed up to a press conference in suits and clergy collars and objected strenuously to the behavior of the police. The headline in the San Francisco Chronicle said, "Angry ministers rip police." The report said, ministers of 4 Protestant denominations accused the police department yesterday of intimidation, broken promises, and obvious hostility in breaking up a private event for homosexuals in California Hall Friday night. They charged that they too had been harassed by police officials and questioned at length about their theological concepts. Sounds like the Pharisees. The hall was attended by nearly 600 homosexuals and their friends and a dozen ministers and their wives. Police saturated the hall with from 20 to 40 police officers, arrested 6 persons, terrified the guests, and broke up the party an hour early. Think about the risk it took for these clergy to stand up in public, to advocate for people who were at the time considered perverse, sick, and immoral. True, they were mostly white men, except for Cecil Williams, who was a black minister who went on to become the celebrated pastor of Glide Memorial Church. But part of having privilege is using privilege for the sake of others. Jesus used his privilege this way. Jesus was educated. He was a teacher, a rabbi. Part of why it was so scandalous for him to associate with the outcast was that in sitting down and eating with them, it might be seen as showing approval. It also strikes me just how early the Council on Religion and the Homosexual was in addressing the oppression of LGBTQ people 4.5 years before Stonewall. Getting ahead of society on an issue of discrimination is not really what mainline churches are known for. The early prophetic nature of the council reminds me of the work of St. John's in the sanctuary movement. Standing up for refugees and undocumented immigrants in the 80s was early prophetic work. Another important early movement that took place here in the Bay Area was the Compton's Cafeteria riot, which happened a little over a year after the council's New Year's ball. This was when a group of drag queens and trans women fought back against police harassment in one of their late night hangouts at the Tenderloin. There's a great documentary about it called Screaming Queens, The Riot at Compton's Cafeteria. Fabulous title. I also want to say that I'm proud of our presbyteries. This spring, we ratified Amendments 24A and 24C passed by the General Assembly. These amendments include sexual orientation and gender identity in the non-discrimination clause of the Presbyterian Book of Order. This is not an early move by the denomination, but it is timely. As Slatts Toole, co-moderator of Covenant Network of Presbyterians, stated, in a time when trans and non-binary people are often seen as political issues instead of actual humans, it is powerful to see Presbyterians from all over the country say, we believe that LGBTQIA+ folks are the beloved children of God. So what do we take from this? How do we celebrate pride in this economy, in this difficult time and place? Well, for one, we can take strength in our faith tradition. There's a simple answer to all of the slogans people have tried to come up with to promote Christianity. What would Jesus do? Stand with the outcasts and politically unpopular members of society. Those billboards that say, he gets us, that's fine, as long as us means undocumented immigrants and LGBTQ people and trans youth and trans athletes and gender fluid and non-binary people and trans people of color. If these groups are not included in us, then your concept of Jesus is too narrow. We can also be proud of the moments when ordinary Christians have stood up to bigotry and harassment against excluded people, like the council, or when people at the bottom of the social ladder have pushed back and fought for their rights, like the queens and trans women at Compton's cafeteria and at Stonewall. We can choose to be early in our support for these communities, rather than waiting to see which way the political winds are blowing before we commit. And finally, maybe most of all, we can celebrate. Embrace Jesus' party ethic. It's hard to push back against the overwhelming forces against us. They're trying to demoralize us. Don't let them. When they try to erase us from the narrative, it actually makes our job easier. Simply to exist is to resist. Take joy in our community. Draw strength from the incredible diversity of the people and personalities we get to form relationships with. We have the privilege of being counted with the sinners and the outcasts. And that means we get to be with Jesus. Party on, dude.
Sky.
Go stand with the outcasts, be early to the feast of inclusion, and most of all, celebrate.